Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Tonight, let's leave behind the glowing rectangles and the shrillness of the modern world. Close the app notifications, silence the updates, and step back, way back, into a time when thunder wasn't just a sound in the sky. It was a god clearing his throat. Tonight, we begin the story of a goddess not born in a cradle or held in a mother's arms, but one who arrived fully formed, armoured and dangerous, from the cracked skull of Olympus's king. This is the terrifying birth of Athena. In the vast mythology of ancient Greece, gods were born in flames, waves, storms and screams. But none quite like this. Zeus, the all-powerful sky god, had swallowed his pregnant consort Metis, goddess of wisdom and deep thought, not out of hunger, but fear. You see, an old prophecy had warned him that a child born of Metis would surpass even Zeus in strength and mind. The idea of being outmatched, even by his own offspring, filled the great Olympian with dread. So, like any tyrant desperate to outmaneuver fate, he chose the most radical of solutions: eliminate the threat before it could grow. Metis was gone, or so Zeus thought. But the wisdom goddess did not vanish into nothingness. She lived on, gestating within the king's mind, whispering from inside, her essence coiled like a snake behind his eyes. And one day Zeus began to suffer, not just a headache, but a splitting, blinding, skull-cracking pain, so intense it shook Mount Olympus itself. The gods gathered, no one knew what to do. Panicked, he summoned Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith. No healer, no potion, no prayer could help, only the swing of a hammer. And so, with a breath held by every being on Olympus, Hephaestus lifted his forge-hardened blade and struck the god's forehead. And from that wound, brilliant, glowing, roaring, came Athena. Not crying, not fragile, not naked. She emerged fully grown, clad in gleaming armour, shield in one hand, spear in the other, helmet resting on her brow, unbothered by blood, her eyes clear, unshaking, her stance complete. There were no midwives, no swaddling cloths, no lullabies. Only the echo of metal and thought. Aphrodite came from sea foam, seductive and soft. Artemis and Apollo were twin children born on a drifting island. But Athena came from the brain of power itself. She was not just born of wisdom, she was wisdom weaponized. And what a message that birth sent. To the ancient Greeks, this myth wasn't just spectacle. It was instruction. Athena's arrival taught that true power doesn't come from muscle alone. It comes from clarity, from thought sharpened into purpose. Her armour was not meant to gleam, but to reflect the blinding light of intellect. Her sword was not rage, it was logic made lethal. There's a reason she never married, never bore children, never softened. The Greeks imagined her untouched by desire, not because she was cold, but because she was complete. Not empty, but whole. In a pantheon crowded with passion, revenge, seduction and chaos, she stood apart, serene, untouchable, dangerous in a way no man or god quite understood. And yet, she wasn't cruel. That's what made her even more terrifying. Her justice was clean, not vengeful. Her decisions measured, not emotional. Athena didn't lash out like Hera, or seduce like Aphrodite. She calculated, she judged. And if she found you wanting, she struck, not from hate, but from precision. Imagine being a mortal under her gaze. Other gods punished out of whim or offence. But Athena, she punished with purpose. A spider cursed to weave for eternity. A hero aided through cunning trials. A city gifted not with storms or spectacle, but with an olive tree. Practical, useful, permanent. And all of this because a god once tried to swallow a thought. Zeus feared the prophecy because he misunderstood the real danger. It wasn't that Athena would overpower him with brute force. It's that she wouldn't need to. She would win the world's loyalty through brilliance, through restraint, through the terrifying serenity of reason. And so, the goddess who walked fully formed from the forehead of Olympus's tyrant did not just become part of the pantheon. She became its conscience, its strategist, its judge. She became the mind of Olympus. And somewhere, even now, if you listen close, when decisions are made with calm clarity, when silence overtakes rage, when justice chooses reason over retribution, you can hear the echo of a hammer striking a skull. And from that blow, a goddess still watching. Athena did not cry when she emerged. She did not wail like a newborn or look around in wonder. She stared straight ahead, eyes already shaped by purpose. And Olympus, with all its shifting alliances, vices and chaos, suddenly felt quieter. Her siblings were forces of nature. Poseidon could sink islands when angered. Apollo flung plagues with ease. Dionysus reduced minds to madness. But Athena operated on a different plane. Her presence reminded the other gods of something unnerving restraint. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need spectacle. She only needed time, clarity, and intent. And in the company of immortals driven by lust, pride, and rage, that made her truly fearsome. The myths rarely show her losing her temper. But when she did, it wasn't thunder and flames. It was swift, elegant, final, like a scalpel. Take the story of Tiresias, the unfortunate mortal who once stumbled upon Athena bathing. For his accidental trespass, she blinded him, not with cruelty, but with control. Yet even in punishment, she offered balance. In place of his vision, she gave him the gift of prophecy. That duality, retribution paired with recompense, defined her. A divine surgeon, cutting where necessary, stitching where earned. The ancient Greeks didn't just worship Athena. They modelled parts of their civilization on her. You can see it in the design of their city-states, especially Athens, which bore her name like a crown. The Acropolis, built high above the chaos of the streets, wasn't just a fortress or a temple. It was a symbol of elevation, not just physically, but mentally. Rising above base impulse, above instinct, above noise. Athens chose her over Poseidon for a reason. His gift during their contest was dramatic, a crashing spring of salt water from a trident strike, impressive, yes, but ultimately useless. Athena's olive tree was quieter, humble, but it offered sustenance, trade, healing, even firewood. Her power wasn't in the awe she could inspire, it was in the stability she could provide. One god flexed, the other built, and the city that would give birth to democracy, philosophy, and drama chose the builder. But make no mistake, that did not make her soft. The Greeks understood that wisdom, when it takes a stand, becomes dangerous. Ares raged across battlefields, but Athena chose her moments. She favoured those who strategized, who listened, who waited. Odysseus, most famously. Her relationship with him was not romantic, nor maternal. It was a bond of equals. He was her mirror in mortal form, cunning, adaptive, ruthlessly pragmatic. Others, like Achilles or Heracles, fought with brute strength. Odysseus won wars with silence, disguise, lies carefully placed. That kind of power doesn't inspire songs of glory. It rewrites the outcomes of wars. Her judgment was often absolute. There were no second chances with Athena when arrogance crossed the line. Arachne, a mortal woman who dared to challenge the gods through her tapestry, discovered this in the most painful way. Athena didn't just defeat her in the contest of weaving, she destroyed her work and transformed her into a spider, condemning her to a lifetime of spinning thread. It wasn't rage, it was order restored. In her view, Arachne had mocked divine authority, and more dangerously, exposed divine scandal. That could not be left unanswered. But underneath the severity, there was a consistent logic. Unlike gods who punished out of whimsy or revenge, Athena's actions always followed a pattern. Disrespect the natural balance, suffer the consequences. But follow the path of reason, and you might earn her protection, even if you were mortal. Her iconography reflected this duality. The owl, not a beautiful creature by Greek standards, was sacred to her. It didn't sing, it didn't soar, but it saw clearly in darkness. It knew when to act and when to stay hidden. The owl perched on her shoulder was more than an animal companion. It was a symbol of her deepest value, perception over passion. The aegis she wore, often described as a cloak fringed with serpents and bearing the head of Medusa, was another warning. Athena didn't flaunt beauty or charm. She wore terror itself, petrifying gaze and all across her chest, not to attack, but to shield, to announce, without a word, that wisdom protects, but it also petrifies. She did not smile easily, but when she did, it meant something had gone precisely according to plan. In the cultural memory of Greece, Athena became more than a goddess. She became a model for what a civilization could be if it valued thought above thrill. Her temples weren't arenas for sacrifice and song. They were places of quiet reverence, where citizens came to pray not for wealth or love, but for guidance, for clarity. Even her virginity was weaponized, not in the sense of denial, but in the sense of autonomy. She did not reject men out of disdain, she simply didn't need them, she was complete at birth. She didn't evolve through marriage, didn't define herself through relationships, she made her own identity. In a mythological landscape littered with seductions, betrayals, and messy love triangles, Athena stood like a column of marble, unmoving, unbending, quietly enduring. What the Greeks feared, they also respected. And Athena, though capable of immense destruction, chose not to indulge in it unless forced. She was the blade that stayed in the sheath, but once drawn, never missed. Her presence in battle meant the cause was just, the decision deliberate, the outcome inevitable. And so, Athena's place in Olympus was never about popularity or affection. It was about necessity. The other gods could laugh and scheme and burn and sing, but when the world grew unstable, when judgment, not indulgence, was needed, they turned to the one who had stepped from the skull of Zeus, wearing strategy like armor and silence like a sword. Athena's relationship with war was unlike that of any other deity. While gods like Ares revelled in bloodshed and chaos, taking pleasure in the cries of the dying and the clash of steel, Athena's view of war was colder, cleaner, yet far more calculated. She didn't fight for the thrill, she fought to win. Not just to dominate an enemy, but to sculpt a new order from the ashes. The Greeks made a clear distinction between two kinds of war. One was brutal and impulsive, the domain of Ares, god of frenzy and slaughter. His kind of violence was wild, roaring, unpredictable. He charged without thought, struck without warning, and left nothing but broken bodies in his wake. But Athena's war was different. It was tactical, measured. A campaign drawn out like a blueprint. A spear aimed with precision, not fury. Her kind of warfare didn't just break bones, it broke systems. When armies marched under her favor, they didn't storm blindly into battlefields. They positioned. They waited. They moved with silence and synchronization. She favored generals over warriors, sieges over slaughters. Cities conquered by Athena's hand were not drenched in glory, but they endured and they flourished. And yet, for all her strategic genius, she was never soft. She did not flinch from conflict. In fact, she welcomed it so long as it was justified. That was her doctrine. War is not wrong, but war without purpose is disgraceful. Ares might crush skulls in a fit of rage, but Athena held back until every move aligned like pieces on a sacred game board. And when she did strike, the blow landed with terrifying finality. In the Iliad, where gods and mortals clash in a blood-soaked symphony of ego and vengeance, Athena's presence always signals a shift in logic. When Achilles nearly slaughtered Agamemnon in a fit of temper, it was Athena who intervened, not with thunder, not with fire, but with words. She appeared to him unseen by others, calming his fury with reason, reminding him of honor, of legacy. She didn't command, she persuaded, and Achilles listened. That in itself was a miracle. Ares, in contrast, was a liability even to his allies. He would charge into battle, screaming, striking both friend and foe alike in the madness of it all. He had power, yes, but no discipline. He was the raw, unfiltered male rage the Greeks feared even as they indulged it. Athena was the antidote. Her war was war with intention. She didn't seek carnage, she sought correction. This distinction ran deeper than myth. It mirrored Greek society. While Sparta bred warriors who worshipped combat as an identity, Athens, Athena's city, taught its youth to think before they struck. Their citizen soldiers were trained in rhetoric as well as swordplay. Their democracy, flawed as it was, reflected the goddess's belief that speech could be as sharp as steel. Even her symbols reflected her tactical brilliance. The shield decorated with Medusa's head wasn't just for defense. It paralyzed enemies with fear before a blow was even struck. Psychological warfare, centuries before the term existed. Her spear, always poised, was never shown in motion. It was potential energy restrained, waiting. It told her enemies, I can end this at any moment, but I choose not to yet. What made her more dangerous than Ares was that she saw the full board, not just the square in front of her. While others reacted, she anticipated. And in mythology, foresight is a divine weapon few could wield properly. She didn't just see what was happening, she saw what could happen and prepared accordingly. But her view of war also had its limits. She believed in control, and sometimes the battlefield had other ideas. When mortals acted irrationally, when pride overtook caution, even Athena could be outmaneuvered, not in skill, but in unpredictability. The Greeks, for all their admiration of her, knew that intellect could only go so far when faced with madness. Still, among the pantheon, she was the only god whose involvement in war didn't feel like indulgence. For Ares, war was an appetite. For Athena, it was a responsibility. And responsibility carries weight. She didn't march into battle for fun. She marched because no one else was thinking clearly. This is what made her terrifying to the Greeks. Not because she was cruel, but because she was so utterly unshakable. In a world of passion and betrayal, Athena stood like stone. You could plead to her, argue with her, even worship her, but you could never manipulate her. She was unmovable in her logic, and therefore impossible to outplay. Even her victories weren't celebrated with song. There were no drunken festivals for her triumphs, because victory, in her world, wasn't about pride. It was about precision, and precision doesn't sing, it watches. It remembers. It waits for the next flaw in the opponent's strategy. Her opponents, both mortal and divine, often underestimated her because she didn't raise her voice. But her silence was louder than thunder. It was the silence that comes just before the final move on a chessboard. The silence of knowing the outcome before the pieces are even touched. In time, warriors who sought her blessing didn't just ask for strength, they asked for clarity. They prayed for discipline under pressure, for the ability to think in fear, to remain still in a storm. They knew that true victory wasn't in the force of your swing, but in the moment you chose to swing. And in that single moment, Athena reigned supreme. Athena didn't need temples filled with the clang of swords or sacrificial blood spilled in her name. Her battlefield was quieter. Sometimes not a battlefield at all, but a council hall, a courtroom, a mind in torment. She knew war began long before the first spear was thrown. It started in a glance, a lie, a poorly chosen word. And because she understood its roots, she understood how to win without lifting a blade. When you look closely at the ancient myths, the real brilliance of Athena's warcraft lies in her ability to prevent disaster as often as she instigated victory. She believed in strategy not just as a means to defeat an enemy, but as a method to avoid unnecessary suffering. Her interventions were always surgical, no wasted energy, no dramatic outbursts, just a quiet redirection of fate. Consider her role in the Trojan War. She didn't start the conflict. Her rivalry with Aphrodite and Hera over the golden apple was a symptom, not a cause. But once the war began, her fingerprints were everywhere. She guided heroes, exposed weakness, bent moments to her will. Unlike other gods who chose favorites based on vanity or revenge, Athena aligned herself with those who shared her values: logic, loyalty, adaptability. Her support of the Greeks wasn't blind allegiance. It was strategic alignment. They were, in her eyes, the side that best embodied discipline and thought, at least in the beginning. But even then she watched closely, ready to withdraw her favor the moment their actions betrayed her ideals. And when they did, when Greek warriors sacked Troy and desecrated her temple, she did not simply pout like a scorned deity. She responded with absolute clarity. Storms, curses, delayed voyages. The wrath of intellect is not fire, it is consequence. And still she remained a patron of heroes, but not the loudest ones. Not those who chased fame or ran headfirst into blades to earn a song. She chose those who hesitated, who schemed, who listened. Odysseus most of all. Athena saw something in him that no other god could understand: restraint. He could lie when needed, hide his pride, even take a beating if it meant winning the long game. The other gods saw his cunning as deceit. Athena saw it as maturity. She did not need champions who fought gloriously. She needed ones who could endure. And Odysseus, for all his flaws, endured like no other. But their relationship wasn't just one of divine protector and mortal hero. It was almost collaborative. She gave him nudges, signs, disguises. He, in turn, trusted her implicitly, not like a believer worships a god, but like a general relies on his best advisor. They were aligned not by fate, but by philosophy. In all of Greek mythology, there may be no purer example of mind recognizing mind. Athena's influence wasn't limited to individuals. She shaped entire cities. Athens itself, draped in her name and draped in her principles, became a kind of living monument to her vision of conflict and civilization. The Athenians built not only temples and walls, but institutions, law courts, debating chambers, theatres, arenas of intellectual combat. Disagreement wasn't punished, it was sharpened, refined. And when war came to their gates, they didn't just raise shields, they prepared speeches. This didn't make them weak. It made them dangerous in a way that frightened even their enemies. Sparta had spears and drills and discipline, but Athens had thinkers, engineers, rhetoricians, spies. Their strength was distributed, internal, and it made them unpredictable, just like their patroness. Athena taught that control over the self was more valuable than control over the enemy. And in this, she stood in direct opposition to nearly every other god on Olympus. They acted on impulse, she acted on evaluation. The stories never show her drunk, enraged, seduced, or deceived. Even tricksters like Hermes and Dionysus respected her space, not because she threatened them with punishment, but because her presence left no room for chaos. There's an old pattern in mythology: gods are feared for their power, loved for their flaws. But Athena inverted that. She was feared because she had no flaws that could be exploited. You couldn't seduce her, bribe her, or sway her. You couldn't rile her up. And once she made a decision, it was final. She didn't speak often, but when she did, the debate was over. Her strategies weren't always kind, though. That's the uncomfortable truth beneath her gleaming image. Athena didn't champion the underdog out of pity. She didn't forgive easily. Her justice was often harsh. A miscalculation could cost you everything, not because she was vindictive, but because she didn't believe in second guesses. Arachne learned this the hard way. A gifted weaver who dared to depict the gods' misdeeds in a tapestry so flawless it rivaled the divine. She forced Athena to confront something rare being bested. And though Athena admired the craft, she couldn't allow the insult to stand. She destroyed the work, humiliated the woman, then transformed her into a spider, condemning her to weave forever in darkness. It was not an act of rage. It was preservation of order, of image. Athena believed in limits, and when mortals forgot them, she reminded them, not with shouting or storms, but with silence that echoed for eternity. So many gods punished from wounded pride, Athena punished from logic, and that's what made her so chilling. When Ares slaughters, you see the blood. When Athena strikes, you see the world shift. The target falls, the plan unfolds, and everyone realizes, too late, she was 10 steps ahead. Even today, in political halls and military schools, her name echoes, not as a warrior, but as a strategist, not as a goddess of war, but of how war should be approached only when needed, and only when thought through. In the end, Athena's war was never about death. It was about the aftermath, what remains, what you build from it. She didn't care how many you killed, she cared what came next. A battle is just a moment. A society is a legacy, and that, more than anything, is why her wars were so dangerous. She never bent her head to any lover, not once. In all the tangled knots of Greek mythology, where gods transformed into bulls and swans to pursue mortals, where nymphs fled into trees, and even goddesses surrendered to desire, Athena stood untouched. Not untouched in the romantic sense, but untouched in something far more radical: autonomy. She did not flirt, did not weep for love, did not desire companionship. She didn't need validation, adoration, or even alliance. From the very moment she stepped out of Zeus's skull, she was whole. She arrived into the world with armor, with intellect, and with clarity. There was no becoming. She already was. The Greeks called her Parthenos, the virgin goddess. But that title didn't mean purity in the modern moralistic sense. It meant independence, no bonds, no obligations, no compromises. Unlike Hera, who raged within her marriage, or Aphrodite, whose identity pulsed with passion, Athena refused to be tethered to another. She wasn't defined by any counterpart. She was her own authority. And that was dangerous. In a society that built its mythologies around women as mothers, seductresses, or victims, Athena broke the mold. She wasn't prey like Daphne, who ran from Apollo until she became a tree. She wasn't tragic like Medusa, transformed for being violated. She wasn't motherly like Demeter or nurturing like Hestia. She was a force. Cold, brilliant, composed. The Greeks admired that, but they also feared it. There's something unsettling about a woman who needs no one. The Parthenon, her great temple in Athens, was named for this aspect of her. A house for the maiden, but not a maiden in the sense of youth or inexperience. Athena's maidenhood was a wall, a boundary, an announcement, do not enter. Not even the other gods dared to violate it, not because they respected it, but because they knew they wouldn't win. Poseidon, famously impulsive and often predatory, once clashed with her violently over control of Athens. In one telling of a myth, he even pursued Medusa into Athena's temple. When it happened, Athena didn't lash out at Poseidon, perhaps because she couldn't, but she punished Medusa instead, transforming her into a creature whose very gaze turned men to stone. A brutal outcome, but within it was a twisted sort of logic. If they fear you, they won't touch you again. Athena turned victimhood into a weapon. She turned silence into a message. No one would ever trespass on her domain without consequence. In art, she's always shown alone. Helmet tilted forward, spear in hand, shield at her side, no child in her arms, no lover nearby, no wistful gaze into the distance, just focus, authority, distance. And when she appears in sculpture or pottery, it's not in soft curves or flowing garments, but in symmetry, structure, posture. She is stone that thinks, marble that strategizes. She doesn't lean, she anchors. And yet, the Greeks didn't portray her as cold-hearted or cruel. That's the subtlety. Athena cared deeply, but she cared about justice, not affection. She defended cities, guided kings, protected heroes. She offered wisdom, not warmth, protection, not passion. There's something powerfully modern in how she was written. She didn't apologize for her strength. She didn't soften herself to become more palatable. She didn't pretend to be nurturing just to fit in among the Olympians. She held her ground, made her presence felt through actions, not declarations. While gods like Apollo demanded temples and songs, Athena let her works speak. The olive tree, the laws, the victories of clever warriors. She left fingerprints on civilization itself, and in doing so, she became a kind of blueprint, not for women necessarily, but for anyone who wanted to lead without dependence. Still, there's a loneliness that lingers in the myths, an implied distance. Athena has no equal, no confidant, no vulnerability ever shown. She doesn't fall, she doesn't fail, and the cost of that perfection is isolation. The myths never say it out loud, but they show it. She's always outside the feast, above the battle, beside the hero, but never with them. She saves Odysseus, but never embraces him. She aids Perseus, but keeps her distance. She guides mortals, but never touches them. She's the voice in their mind, not the hand in theirs. The Greeks, for all their wisdom, were still uneasy with that kind of strength. They honoured Athena, but they never quite understood her. They needed their goddesses to love and to grieve, to nurture or to rage. Athena did neither. She simply existed in control. And control, when absolute, becomes alien. Still, her image endured, not because people related to her, but because they needed her. In every culture's pantheon, there's a figure who doesn't play by the rules, who doesn't seek approval, who walks alone. For the Greeks, that was Athena, and maybe that's why she lasted. Long after temples crumbled and sacrifices ceased, long after myths became metaphors and gods became memory, Athena's presence could still be found. In the courthouse, in the academy, in the quiet student, poring over philosophy by candlelight, not in warmth, but in will. Her legacy wasn't left in poems of longing or shrines to fertility. It was carved in the silence that comes with deep respect. Athena didn't need followers who worshipped her with wine or hymns. She needed them to think, to hesitate before reacting, to weigh each word like a blade. And so, while other gods were adored for their drama, Athena was honoured in ritual, in reason, in restraint. Her refusal to be tamed wasn't just personal, it was political. In a mythological world where chaos reigned and emotions dictated the skies, Athena's presence was governance. She embodied boundaries, not just for herself, but for the entire social order. When she stood unmoved by romance, untouched by scandal, uninterested in seduction, she created a space where logic, not lust, held power. But her independence didn't mean indifference. She often fought for those who couldn't protect themselves, but she did so with measured hand. When her chosen cities faced destruction, she intervened, not with hysteria, not with storms, but with strategy. She wasn't the scream in the night, she was the shield in the silence. The paradox of Athena is that she was both feared and needed. In a culture where women were largely confined to domestic spaces, Athena was the one female figure allowed to sit among the ruling gods, not as wife, not as mother, but as a peer. That status alone made her revolutionary, but the cost of that seat was high. She had to cut away anything that made her seem soft. Vulnerability became risk. So she locked it all behind iron, behind the gleam of bronze, behind the edge of her unblinking gaze. Other gods may have fallen from grace, betrayed their lovers, wept in defeat, but Athena never stumbled, not once. And that is precisely what made her so difficult to worship in a personal sense. She offered no drama, no confession. She was consistent. And for most people, that made her unreachable. And yet, when Athens called itself hers, it wasn't just branding. It was a declaration. This was a city that would mirror its goddess, one that prized dialogue over conquest, architecture over destruction, innovation over indulgence. Even when the Athenians failed to live up to that ideal, as all mortals do, the image of Athena stood as a reminder of who they were supposed to be, a stillness above the noise, a principle above politics. Her cult didn't grow from scandal or prophecy, but from a lived ideal. She wasn't invoked to predict the future, she was invoked to survive the present, to make the right choice when every option looked like a trap. She didn't promise miracles, she expected discipline. And in a chaotic world, discipline is a rare kind of magic. Even in her relationships with mortals, Athena's independence cast a long shadow. Take Telemachus, son of Odysseus. When he wandered, unsure of his future, it was Athena who appeared, not in overwhelming divine radiance, but disguised, calm, instructive. She didn't coddle him. She gave him information, tools, direction. She made him act. That was her gift, the push toward agency. She didn't rescue, she revealed. And those she chose never became heroes through strength alone. They became heroes because they learned to think, to doubt, to weigh. In that way, she was not just a goddess of wisdom, but of evolution. She selected those who could adapt, and those who couldn't, she left behind. Even in punishment, she forced her opponents to become something else. Arachne became the spider, Medusa the monster, not erased, but transformed. Condemned, yes, but also made eternal in a way. Her justice carried the weight of change, not destruction. That too is power. But this detachment, this divine distance, also led many to misunderstand her. Some saw her as cold, even cruel. Others saw her as a traitor to womanhood, for she showed little sisterhood to other goddesses. She stood apart not only from men, but from women as well. Hera raged at Zeus's infidelities. Aphrodite wept and schemed. Artemis fled the world of men altogether. Athena didn't rage or cry or run. She simply opted out. In doing so, she broke the template, and the ancient world never quite knew how to place her. So they built her into the skyline. The statue of Athena Parthenos once stood over 40 feet tall within the Parthenon, made of ivory and gold, not smiling, not singing, but watching. Her shield decorated with battles, her spear ready, her feet planted, and the owl silent on her shoulder, as if to say, "Wisdom does not blink." That statue wasn't just worship, it was a warning. This was what unshakable order looked like, what power without dependency felt like, what a mind unclouded by longing could achieve. And even as time passed and new empires rose and fell, her image endured. She was reimagined not as a goddess, but as an ideal. Liberty in France, reason in Enlightenment, Europe, justice in the United States. Wherever someone drew a woman in armor, holding balance in one hand and intellect in the other, Athena had returned, not as a whisper, not as a myth, but as memory turned into symbol. She may have refused to be tamed, but in that refusal she became something far more permanent than any lover's embrace or any mortal temple. She became a blueprint, and blueprints do not age. They are built upon. Before the city had a name, before its temples pierced the sky, and its philosophers wrote their legacies into the bedrock of Western thought, it was just a rocky peninsula, a scrap of land between sea and hills, filled with shepherds, tradesmen, and dust. But even then, it caught the attention of the gods. Olympus, ever watchful, saw potential, and like all things the gods touched, it sparked rivalry. Poseidon wanted it, and so did Athena. In a contest that would echo through eternity, the two Olympians stood before the early people of the land and offered them gifts, symbols of what they could bring, what they could build, what kind of future they envisioned. Poseidon, god of the sea, the shaker of earth, struck his trident into the rock. From the split came a roar of salt water and the birth of a spring deep, booming, dramatic. Power in liquid form. It was the sort of gesture mortals couldn't ignore. They gasped. They knelt. To control water meant trade, travel, protection from drought. And Poseidon knew spectacle. He didn't whisper. He thundered. His gift was a performance. But salt water is deceptive. It glistens, it flows, it teases the thirst, but it cannot quench it. Then came Athena. No theatrics, no noise. Just a quiet planting. A single seed pressed into the earth, followed by a gentle touch. The next morning, an olive tree stood where there had been nothing. Its roots reached down into the soil with slow certainty. Its branches spread like an open hand, steady and unshaken. It bore fruit, not for show, but for use. Oil for light, leaves for shade, wood for warmth. Food that could be pressed, stored, traded. It wasn't flashy, it was functional. And the people understood. They chose the olive tree, they chose Athena. It's tempting to frame this as a victory of humility over arrogance, but the truth is sharper. Athena didn't win because she was modest. She won because she was precise. She saw what the city could become, not what would impress it today, but what would sustain it for centuries. Poseidon offered a surge. Athena offered endurance. The lesson wasn't subtle, and the Greeks never intended it to be. This was a myth about identity, about values, about what it means to build a civilization not on strength, but on sustainability. The sea rages. Trees endure. In choosing Athena, the people weren't rejecting Poseidon's might. They were declaring that their survival depended on reason, not force. But gods, like men, don't take rejection well. Poseidon's fury was instant. He flooded the lowlands, sent waves crashing into the shores, shook the earth beneath the infant city's foundations. It wasn't just revenge. It was grief twisted into violence. A reminder that power, when denied, becomes unpredictable. But Athena held her ground. Not with counterattacks or curses, but with stability. She protected her city not with waves, but with walls. Not with floods, but with laws. Her vengeance wasn't chaos. It was structure. And so the city was named Athens. From then on, the olive tree became sacred, not just as a crop, but as a concept. It represented diplomacy, wisdom, patience. Even today, the olive branch endures as a symbol of peace, but its roots, deep in myth, are not passive. They are deliberate, chosen, strategic. The sacred olive was said to still grow atop the Acropolis, long after generations of rulers, long after philosophers were dust and conquerors had marched through its streets. The tree, according to legend, could not be killed. Even when burned or chopped, it regrew. Its roots never died. It became the soul of the city, not loud, not glorious, but invincible through persistence. Athena's victory wasn't just symbolic. It shaped the way Athenians saw themselves. To be Athenian was not just to be Greek. It was to think before acting, to build for the long term, to trust the seed more than the storm. Their democracy, their schools, their courts, all emerged from that single choice, not because they were perfect, but because they believed in the process of improvement, in ideas that took root and grew. And Athena, watchful, silent, never sentimental, became their patron, not a protector in the emotional sense, but in the architectural sense. She was a cornerstone, an axis, a reference point. The laws they wrote, the arguments they held in open squares, the plays they staged in open air, all these, in their minds, existed beneath her gaze. There's irony in how gently she won that city. No battles, no divine duel, no bloodshed, just a tree, a gift, a vision of a future not yet born. It's easy to miss how radical that was. Most gods claimed their followers through force or fear. Athena asked for choice, and won. And in winning, she didn't gloat. She built. She built not with thunderbolts or conquest, but with ideas planted as quietly and deliberately as that olive tree. And over time, that tree became more than myth. It became memory, a living symbol of the kind of power that doesn't vanish when the noise dies down, the kind of influence that doesn't demand attention but shapes everything from beneath the surface. Athens didn't just carry Athena's name, it mirrored her nature. The city's identity formed around balance between war and reason, debate and decision, chaos and control. Just like their goddess, the Athenians valued intellect over impulse, deliberation over display. And even when their history veered into contradiction and hypocrisy, as all civilizations eventually do, they held to the illusion that Athena was still watching, that her standards still mattered. The olive tree wasn't just admired for its usefulness, it became sacred law. Damaging it was a crime. Cutting it down wasn't vandalism, it was blasphemy. The state tracked these trees, documented them, protected them. Every branch was a testament not just to the goddess's favor, but to the ideals she stood for: permanence, patience, and purpose. Athens itself became a vessel for her virtues. Its democracy, radical for its time, was rooted in participation, reason, and rhetorical skill. Every citizen who stood in the assembly, every philosopher in the agora, every playwright twisting the politics of the day into satire or tragedy, all of them were children of Athena, whether they believed in her or not. But the olive tree's triumph was not just symbolic within Greece. It became, over centuries, a universal metaphor. Peace negotiations, surrender terms, even post-war treaties were sealed with olive branches. But beneath the veneer of gentleness, the message remained sharp. The offering of peace is not the absence of power, it is the restraint of it. And this was Athena's brilliance. She didn't try to outshine Poseidon's show of force. She didn't try to overpower his waves or mimic his grandeur. She offered something deeper, something that would last long after the salt had dried and the noise had faded. She understood something about time that most gods and most mortals never grasped. That endurance outlasts spectacle. That subtlety shapes more than storms. That insight made her one of the most complex deities of the ancient world. Poseidon was vast and immediate. His wrath came in tidal waves. His influence was loud. But it was Athena's quiet understanding of human need, shelter, food, trade, security, that built loyalty. People don't worship what dazzles them forever. They worship what feeds them, warms them, protects their children. And Athena gave them that, branch by branch. Still, her victory didn't sit well with the Olympians. The gods thrived on competition, on dominance. That a goddess could win without violence unsettled them. And so Athena became isolated in a way none of the others were. She didn't share their indulgences, their jealousies, their chaotic entanglements. She stood apart, not out of pride, but precision. To interfere more often would be to risk imbalance. She intervened only when logic demanded it, and logic rarely makes friends. Over time, as Athens grew into its own power and influence, Athena's image was carved into every corner of its culture. Her statue in the Parthenon stood over 40 feet tall, made of ivory and gold, towering above the city as if watching its every law, every vote, every betrayal. She wasn't portrayed smiling. Her lips were set, her brow furrowed, her eyes unblinking. A reminder that the goddess who gave the olive tree still expected the city to earn it. There's a reason the tree didn't come with fruit already on its branches. Athena gave them the seed, but not the harvest. That was the condition. The people would have to tend it, protect it, learn its cycles, understand its needs. She gave potential, not paradise, and they accepted it, for centuries. But eventually, like all mortal things, Athens began to fray. Internal divisions, wars with Sparta, betrayal from within, greed, and political gamesmanship all eroded the ideals Athena had once embodied. The tree still stood, the statue still gleamed, but the city began to forget. It replaced discourse with demagoguery, replaced wisdom with wealth. The goddess did not speak, but she no longer guided. Not because she abandoned them, but because they stopped listening. And that's the quiet tragedy embedded in this myth. Athena won with a tree, yes, but that tree required care. It wasn't a miracle. It was an invitation, a pact. And when that pact was broken, not all at once, but slowly, thought by thought, the roots began to dry. The branches grew brittle. The leaves, once sacred, became just leaves again. Even today, we see the olive branch as a symbol of peace, but rarely ask what it requires. Peace, after all, is not passive. It's a choice, a discipline, a war against impulse. And Athena's gift was never about avoiding conflict. It was about controlling it, directing it, limiting its reach and lasting its purpose. That's why the olive tree remains the perfect emblem of her power. It doesn't grow quickly, it doesn't flash or boast, but it endures, it feeds, it shelters. It survives fires and storms and still regenerates. It's not immortal. It's something harder, resilient. And resilience was Athena's truest weapon. Not the spear, not the shield, not even the mind, but the ability to plant something into a broken world and trust that, if tended wisely, it could grow into a civilization. There's a reason gods, no matter how wise or eternal, often find themselves threatened not by monsters or rival deities, but by mortals. Not because mortals are stronger, but because mortals remember, they retell, they preserve, and in their hands stories become mirrors, sometimes too honest for the gods to stomach. Arachne wasn't a queen or a priestess or a warrior, she was a weaver, a young woman from Lydia whose hands spun thread as if guided by something divine. Her work wasn't just skillful, it was hypnotic. Silks flowed like water, patterns twisted with such precision that eyes lingered, unsure if they were looking at cloth or magic. People travelled miles to watch her at her loom, whispering that surely, her talent must have been a gift from the gods. But Arachne rejected that. She insisted her art was hers alone. No divine spark, no secret blessings, just craft, effort, design. And in the world of Greek myth, that kind of claim was not simply arrogant, it was sacrilege, because in Greece, beauty belonged to the gods. All skill, all music, all poetry, all art, they were gifts. To deny that was to spit in the face of Olympus, and few gods took that more personally than Athena, because weaving, in many ways, was Athena's domain. She was not a goddess of inspiration like the Muses. She didn't give fleeting visions or poetic bursts. She represented technique, structure, geometry, the mathematics of artistry. She wove not for beauty's sake, but to show control over chaos, to turn fibres into form, thread into thought. So, when whispers of Arachne's pride reached her, she didn't send a storm. She didn't smite the girl outright. Athena descended, veiled in human form, and approached Arachne as an old woman. She warned her gently, urged humility, suggested that mortals should be careful when speaking of gods, that even the most talented hands owe something to the heavens. But Arachne didn't bend. She mocked the suggestion, refused to acknowledge divine influence. Worse still, she issued a challenge. If Athena thought herself the better weaver, let her prove it. The air must have gone cold then, as the goddess let the disguise fall away. There, in mortal form but unmistakably divine, stood Athena, not angry, not yet, but resolved. If this was to be a contest, then so be it. 2 looms were set, Two women, one ephemeral, began to work. Athena's tapestry was breathtaking. It depicted the glory of Olympus, the triumphs of the gods, their wisdom, their gifts to humanity. Every thread pulsed with colour and order, each scene a testimony to divine grace. Around the border she wove warnings. Mortals punished for their arrogance, humans turned to beasts, to stone, to memory. And Arachne, she chose a different story. Her tapestry was flawless. Even Athena couldn't deny that. The technique, the tension, the detail, beyond even the goddess's own. But it was the subject that shifted the myth into tragedy. Arachne wove scenes not of glory, but of disgrace. Gods tricking mortals, Zeus transforming into animals to seduce or deceive, Poseidon's pursuit of Medusa, Apollo chasing Daphne, Dionysus, wild and staggering. The tapestry exposed not just scandal, but the imbalance of power, the ugliness behind the golden thrones. And she made it beautiful. That was the deepest offence, not the mockery, but the mastery. Athena stared at the finished cloth, silent, still. She did not rage, not immediately. She saw truth in the work. But truth, even when acknowledged, can still be punished. With one motion, Athena tore the tapestry to shreds. The silence that followed must have felt heavier than thunder. Arachne stood motionless, humiliated, not for her failure, but for her success. And in that unbearable moment of judgment she fled. No words, no pleas, just flight, and then despair. She hanged herself, rope-like thread around her neck, a final act of surrender in a world where perfection wasn't protection. But Athena, ever calculating, did not let her die. She transformed her, not into mist or memory, but into something eternal, a spider. Arachne would weave forever. From shadowy corners and forgotten beams, she would spin her threads, silent, tireless, unseen. No longer praised, no longer feared, just there, watching, working, waiting. And so was born the Arachnid, its name still echoing the story, a creature reviled by many, but one that endures. Resilient, intricate, suspended in delicate death traps of its own making. Athena's punishment was not annihilation, it was preservation, a cursed kind of immortality. And that, in many ways, is crueler than destruction. Because Arachne did what no other mortal dared, she exposed the gods, and she did it flawlessly. And in return she was given a fate that honoured her skill, but buried her name. That was the real edge in Athena's justice. It didn't erase you. It refined you into a symbol, then sentenced you to live within it. Arachne had mocked the gods, yes, but her real sin had been her accuracy. In showing the flaws of Olympus, she reminded the world that power, even divine power, was not always noble. And the gods, like rulers in any age, cannot abide being seen too clearly. Still, Athena didn't destroy her. She didn't grind her name into mythic dust like other figures who crossed the divine. Instead, she gave her a different kind of legacy, a body that could survive anywhere, a craft that couldn't be stripped away. The spider doesn't ask for praise, it doesn't seek the centre of the room. But it's always there, in corners, in rafters, in the forgotten silence where no one looks. And it spins endlessly, not for glory, but because it must. Arachne's fate wasn't annihilation. It was to become essential and overlooked all at once. That's the complexity of Athena. She was never a goddess of mercy, but neither was she a monster. Her judgments were swift, often ruthless, but rarely mindless. She didn't lash out to soothe her pride. She acted to restore structure. In her world, talent without reverence was a destabilizing force. And order, more than kindness, more than fairness, was her highest principle. But there's another truth buried under the silken silence of this myth. Athena saw herself in Arachne. How could she not? Both female, both masters of craft, both brilliant, unrelenting, precise. Arachne did what Athena would have done had she been mortal. She identified injustice and stitched it into form. She made sense of pain through design. Her threads told stories others were too afraid to say aloud. And in that reflection, Athena saw danger. Because even gods are not immune to mirrors. The other Olympians reacted to slights with noise. Zeus hurled thunder. Hera brewed storms of jealousy. Apollo cursed poets. Poseidon summoned floods. but Athena responded with transformation. She took what challenged her and turned it into something instructive, even if the lesson came wrapped in cruelty. The Greeks didn't always cheer her for it. They respected her, feared her, built cities in her honor, but they rarely loved her. Not the way they adored Aphrodite or feared Hades. Athena was too distant, too resolved. She never wept, never cracked, never begged for worship. She expected excellence. She gave protection only to those who earned it. And when confronted with rebellion, even in the form of talent, she didn't flinch. She rewrote the offender into the world. Arachne was far from the only mortal punished for overstepping, but her story endured for a reason. It struck a chord with every artist, every creator, every mind who looked at the stories of the gods and dared to ask, what if this isn't divine? What if it's just power? That question is a thread in itself, dangerous, tense, fragile, and Athena, the weaver of reason, had to pull it taut before it unravelled Olympus. Yet even as Arachne's human form faded into legend, the pattern she created lived on. The spider's web is not a weapon, it is a design of survival. A geometry so elegant that engineers still study its strength. A balance of tension and release, form and function, art and trap. It is the perfect reflection of Athena's ideals, minus the praise. Arachne became the silent partner in the myth of the goddess, not praised, but present, not celebrated, but eternal. And perhaps that's the most lasting punishment of all, to create something perfect and never be credited for it. To exist in every corner of the world, but only as a shadow. To hang, upside down, from the rafters of memory while your name fades and your work continues unnoticed. But Athena knew, she always knew. Every time a web glistens in the morning light, catching dew like tiny oracles, every time a thread holds fast against wind or movement, something of Arachne survives. And Athena, despite herself, must remember. Not as guilt, not even as regret, but as evidence that the gods do not destroy what threatens them. They repurpose it, rebrand it, and then place it just out of reach. The lesson here is more human than mythic. That talent, when wielded without caution, becomes its own kind of danger. That truth, when spoken through beauty, becomes subversion. And that the line between divine inspiration and mortal rebellion is thinner than silk. The story of Arachne isn't just a warning to the proud. It's a message to anyone who creates that your art can elevate you, can protect you. But if it exposes too much, it might just become the net that traps you. Athena didn't silence Arachne, she amplified her. But only in form, only in function. She stripped away the voice and left the weave. That's how power works. It doesn't just punish, it reframes. And in doing so, it survives. She had seen kings fall to lust. She had seen warriors undone by pride. She had watched poets lose themselves in their own verses and prophets drown in their visions. The Olympians often toyed with mortals, bending them like reeds in a storm. But there was one man who didn't bend, one man who met Athena's gaze without trembling, who didn't flatter her, beg her, or fear her, but understood her. And that was enough. Odysseus. He wasn't the strongest. That was Achilles. He wasn't the most noble. That was Hector. He wasn't the son of a god, or a man gifted with divine beauty or charm. He was, by all accounts, ordinary in appearance, clever in speech, cautious in action. But he had something Athena prized above all else, cunning. In him she saw a reflection of herself, not a perfect mirror, but a mortal application of divine precision. Odysseus didn't swing wildly. He waited, he observed. He lied, yes, but always for a reason. He wore masks like armor, used his own weaknesses as bait, and played the long game when others rushed to glory. And in that slow, deliberate approach to survival, Athena saw not just a companion, but a kindred mind. Their bond wasn't born in a temple or on a battlefield, but on the currents of necessity. As the Trojan War dragged on, and bronze clanged against bronze for a decade, it became clear that raw strength alone wouldn't win the day. The Greeks needed trickery, and so Athena whispered to Odysseus. Not commands, but ideas, not visions, but instincts. She didn't puppeteer him, she sharpened him. The Trojan horse wasn't her invention, but it bore her fingerprints. A gift that was also a weapon, a gesture that concealed a threat, a story crafted to lower the enemy's guard. It was not just a military tactic, it was myth-making. And Athena, goddess of narrative order, of layered meaning, would have appreciated the symmetry of it. Just as she herself often appeared cloaked in disguise, the horse arrived as a false promise, and within it, victory waited in silence. But war ended, and the journey home began. That's where their relationship deepened. Odysseus's voyage was no swift return. It was a gauntlet of divine retribution, monstrous landscapes, and existential testing. Poseidon, furious over the blinding of his son Polyphemus, turned the sea against him. Zeus remained largely indifferent, but Athena stayed close, not always visible, not always intervening. But there, she saved his ship when others would have let it sink. She veiled him in mist when enemies waited with swords. She disguised him as a beggar, not to humiliate him, but to give him time to think, to assess, to strike only when the moment demanded it. That was always her method, patience sharpened into precision. Even her appearances to him were rare and deliberate. She didn't hover like a protective spirit. She arrived when the choices became too many, when the next step risked undoing everything. She respected his mind too much to solve his puzzles for him. Instead, she offered clarity, guidance just short of instruction. Odysseus, for his part, never took her for granted. He didn't worship her with empty flattery. He treated her presence as a challenge to live up to prove worthy of. That respect wasn't based on fear, but on alignment. He didn't pray for miracles. He adjusted his strategy. He didn't expect rescue. He adapted to the trial. And when he finally arrived at Ithaca, after years of drifting and loss, it was Athena who helped him return, not in triumph, but in calculation. She helped him reclaim his throne, not through divine fire or spectacle, but through misdirection and restraint. Disguised as an old man, he walked among the very men who had stolen his home. He observed their weaknesses, counted their numbers, tested their arrogance. And only when the moment came, when the arrogance had peaked and the trap was set, did he strike. That moment, in the great hall of Ithaca, was as much Athena's victory as his. Yet even then she didn't crown him. She didn't stand at his side for the applause. She disappeared again, like a chess master stepping back from the board. Not because the game was over, but because the lesson had been completed. Their relationship didn't fit into the typical mold of gods and mortals. There was no betrayal, no romance, no tragic fall. It was built on shared principles. Both believed that intellect, not impulse, was the key to survival. Both knew that fate favored the prepared mind. Both understood that stories weren't just entertainments, they were weapons. In many ways, Odysseus was Athena's proof of concept, a mortal who didn't just believe in her ideals, but embodied them. He was her champion not through blood, but through thought, not through sacrifice, but through skepticism. And for that, she gave him something she rarely gave anyone else, consistency. She stayed, even when others forgot their champions, even when the Olympians turned to new entertainments. Athena stayed invested, not because she was sentimental, but because Odysseus reminded her of something rare, that the mortal world, chaotic and flawed as it was, could sometimes echo divine clarity, and that, in a universe built on storm and fire, was worth preserving. There's something about Odysseus that unsettles the gods, not because he defies them, but because he understands them. Where others kneel or rage or worship blindly, Odysseus watches. He listens, he deciphers. That's what Athena saw in him, not obedience, but compatibility, not submission, but comprehension. He didn't need to be told what to do. He knew when to wait, when to speak, and when silence was more lethal than steel. Most mortals are pawns in the gods' dramas. But Odysseus played the game with awareness. Not perfectly, he made mistakes, hubris, lies, delays. But he learned, he adjusted. And in a world ruled by impulse and fate, that made him dangerous, because he didn't just survive gods, he navigated them. Athena watched him walk the razor-thin edge between destiny and decision, never fully in control, but never powerless either. And perhaps that's why she stayed with him long after the war ended, long after the last spear fell, because Odysseus never stopped using his mind. His journey home wasn't a victory lap. It was a gauntlet designed to test not just strength or bravery, but intellectual endurance. Consider Circe, the enchantress who turned men into pigs. Odysseus was immune, not because of brute resistance, but because he listened to Hermes, to reason, to his own instincts. He stepped into Circe's hall knowing the danger, and disarmed it, not with violence, but with wit and caution. He stayed with her, learned from her, even gained her aid. Where others were devoured by temptation, he negotiated with it. Then there was the journey past the sirens. He didn't plug only his own ears, he wanted to hear them. But he planned ahead, bound himself to the mast, gave strict orders to his crew. He knew his limits and accounted for them. That is Athena's brand of intelligence, not the illusion of invincibility, but the humility to prepare for failure. It wasn't that Odysseus avoided ruin, it's that he expected it and worked around it. Athena watched all this not as a distant patron, but almost like a silent collaborator. Every time he used deception, every time he reshaped truth to gain time or space or safety, she recognized the method. Not trickery for ego's sake, but precision. There's a clear line between a liar and a strategist. Odysseus never lied to deceive without purpose. He lied to survive, to position, to win wars no one saw coming. And that was what made his return to Ithaca so fitting. The kingdom wasn't waiting like a loyal dog. It had teeth, suitors in his home, his wife Penelope besieged, his son Telemachus unsure of his place. It was a boiling situation, and any hero might have burst in, sword drawn, demanding loyalty. But Odysseus didn't return as a hero. He returned in disguise. He observed. He listened. He measured the temperature of his own home before making a move. Athena was there, shaping the disguise, guiding the timing, letting him decide the method. She didn't take revenge for him. She gave him the tools, the restraint, the mental clarity to reclaim what was his without descending into chaos. There was satisfaction in that for her, not in the bloodshed, but in the structure of it. In the fact that every suitor who fell had been weighed first, judged, found wanting. Even then, Odysseus didn't crow over his victory, didn't chase glory. He restored order, reclaimed balance, and returned to his family with the quiet dignity of someone who never wanted to be worshipped, only understood. That was his power, and that's why Athena never left his side. In a world of exaggerated masculinity, of muscle-bound champions and god-kissed conquerors, Odysseus was the quiet threat, the one who could break a siege not by battering the walls, but by walking through the front door dressed as someone else. That style of power unnerved people. It still does. Athena recognized that threat because she embodied it. She too was overlooked in the traditional hierarchy of war. Ares, loud and blood-soaked, claimed the battlefield with noise. Athena claimed it with silence, with maps, with foresight, with the understanding that one clean cut at the right moment does more than 1,000 wasted strikes. And so her admiration for Odysseus wasn't emotional. It was intellectual. She didn't love him, she respected him. And for a goddess like Athena, that was a far more sacred gift. There were others she helped. Perseus, for example. She gave him the tools to slay Medusa. But even that felt transactional, a lesson in preparation and courage. With Odysseus, it was different. She followed his story to the end, even into the quiet years after the war, after the heroics faded, because she saw in him not just cleverness, but adaptability, a mortal who could think like a god without needing to become one. Even the way his story ends is telling. Unlike Achilles, who burned bright and died young, or Heracles, who ascended to Olympus in divine spectacle, Odysseus fades out. He becomes a ruler again, a man, a father. His battles become internal, against restlessness, against the slow erosion of identity that peace brings. And still Athena lingers, not to glorify him, not to rescue him, but to witness the rarest thing of all, a mortal who lived a full arc, who didn't peak too early or fall from grace, who evolved. Athena's respect wasn't won through devotion. It was earned through discipline, through choices made when no one was watching, through insight, not impulse. And that's what Odysseus gave her, a reminder that the mortal world, when it thinks before it acts, can rival the heavens. Justice was never sentimental to Athena. She didn't tip the scales with compassion or bend the rules out of pity. She believed in structure, in clarity, in order. And when things fell out of balance, she didn't weep or rage, she corrected them, not with the furious fire of divine wrath, but with the cold hand of consequence. Her justice didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It came like the slow closing of a well-built door, inevitable, final, soundless. To understand what justice meant to Athena, one must look beyond her role in war and strategy. Her truest test came not with sword or shield, but in silence. Inside a courtroom, at a moment when tradition demanded blood and she offered something else. It happened in Athens, appropriately. A city she had helped shape. A people who bore her name and worshipped her discipline. The case was ancient even then. Orestes, son of Agamemnon, had murdered his mother Clytemnestra. She, in turn, had murdered Agamemnon to avenge the sacrifice of their daughter. Blood upon blood, vengeance upon vengeance. The cycle was endless, and by the old rules, Orestes would now be hunted and killed in turn. Justice, in the old sense, meant reciprocity. Eye for eye, life for life. But Athena stepped in. She didn't deny the crime. Orestes had killed his mother. That fact stood like a monolith in the centre of the city. But Athena asked a question no one had dared to pose before. What if justice isn't about balance through destruction? What if it's about restoration through understanding? She created the first court, gathered 12 jurors, put the decision in their hands, not the gods, not the mobs. And when their votes split evenly, she cast the deciding one herself. She chose acquittal, not because she thought Orestes was innocent, but because she believed justice wasn't served by more death. The past had consumed itself. It was time to begin something new. That single act marked a turning point in Greek thought. It was a myth, yes, but myths in Greece were blueprints for reality. The trial of Orestes became a foundational moment in Athenian law. The shift from vengeance to verdict, from fury to forum. And it was Athena, not Zeus, not Apollo, not any male god who made it happen. The Furies, ancient spirits of vengeance, were enraged. For ages they had pursued wrongdoers without pause, feeding on cycles of blood. To them, this was betrayal. But Athena did not banish them. She did not destroy them. She gave them a place in the new system, as the Eumenides, the kindly ones. No longer blind agents of revenge, but part of a structured process. She transformed them, as she so often did, not to erase what came before, but to evolve it. That was her brilliance. Athena didn't just enforce justice, she redesigned it. She took primal instincts and reframed them. Revenge became litigation. Grief became deliberation. She turned rage into rules. And yet her brand of justice remained razor-sharp. It wasn't soft. She didn't forgive lightly, nor excuse wrongdoing. She simply believed punishment should serve purpose. That punishment without clarity only bred more chaos. Where Ares revelled in violence, Athena questioned its consequences. She believed in the chain reaction of decisions, the long arc of accountability. Take the tale of Ajax the Lesser, for example. A man who, in the sack of Troy, violated Cassandra within the very temple of Athena herself. The act wasn't just violent, it was profane. It shattered the fragile line between war and barbarity. And Athena, though she had not intervened in the battle's heat, remembered. As the Greek fleet set sail home, she summoned a storm. Not one that struck all equally, but one that found Ajax. He was cast into the sea, clinging to a rock, defiant even then. When he declared that the gods could not touch him, the rock split beneath him. He vanished into the waves. There was no trial, no second chance. Because some lines, to Athena, could not be crossed. Her justice was not reactive. It was surgical, precise, calculated not for effect, but for message. And that message echoed across time. War has rules. Power has boundaries. The sacred must remain sacred, or civilization dissolves into appetite. In this way, Athena was feared not just for her might, but for her scrutiny. She saw, she remembered, she judged. And unlike the more volatile gods, she didn't forget in the next breath. If you wronged her, she wouldn't shout, she'd wait. Let the evidence build. Let you think you were safe, and then strike, not to destroy your body, but to destroy your certainty. Her justice could be mercy, but only if the system allowed for it. She believed in reform, not erasure. In many ways that made her more terrifying than gods who burned cities or flooded valleys. Because you could bargain with fire, you could flee a storm. But how do you outrun a mind that never loses focus? Athena's version of judgment demanded awareness. It demanded that mortals, and even gods, examine their choices through the lens of impact, not just intent. She didn't punish feelings, she punished outcomes, not for cruelty, but for balance. Because without balance, fought meant nothing. To Athena, the world wasn't divided into good and evil. It was divided into those who understood consequences and those who didn't. Her justice did not come from emotional allegiance, nor did she play favorites with heroes. Even her most trusted champions weren't spared when they failed to meet her standards. Favor, for Athena, was a form of investment, and when that investment soured, she withdrew, not in rage, but in resolve. Take the aftermath of Troy. The Greeks had won, but at what cost? The city was in ruins, temples looted, sacred spaces defiled. It should have been a moment of triumph, yet Athena saw only hubris. The victors were drunk on their own success, their discipline lost in the haze of conquest. Priam's daughters were dragged from altars, statues were desecrated, even children were not spared. The Greeks, favoured by the gods in war, had failed the gods in victory. Athena responded not with fire from the sky, but with storms at sea. Ships that had sailed with her blessing now splintered beneath Poseidon's waves, provoked by her request. She did not act alone. She requested the fury of the elements, but she chose the targets. This was not nature lashing out. It was judgment, precise and personal. It wasn't just Ajax the Lesser who faced her justice. Others were marked as well. Men who had carried her banner during war, but who forgot, in their lust and greed, that favour is a contract. Her silence had been mistaken for approval. That was their mistake. Athena never rewarded loyalty without accountability. Even Odysseus, her most favoured mortal, was not spared hardship. She helped him, yes, but she also allowed him to suffer. Not because she was indifferent, but because hardship for her was a form of instruction. Every island, every storm, every betrayal, each one carved him into a more precise version of himself. Athena didn't hand him peace. She handed him tools, and she watched to see what he would build. This is the heart of her justice transformation through trial. Punishment was rarely just retribution. It was opportunity. If you could endure it, learn from it, grow beyond it, then you earned her respect. If not, you became your own ruin. Athena didn't destroy. She revealed. What you did with that revelation was up to you. Consider Medusa, not the later version told through Christian filters, but the older, raw myth. Medusa was once beautiful, a priestess in Athena's temple. Then came Poseidon. Whether by force or seduction, he lay with her inside the sacred space. And Athena, upon discovering the desecration, did not strike Poseidon. She turned Medusa into a monster. It's a troubling tale, one modern readers rightly wrestle with, but in the framework of ancient myth, it wasn't about blame. It was about the sanctity of space. The temple had been violated. Order had been broken. Athena's response wasn't compassion. It was conservation. Medusa, transformed, became untouchable. Her gaze petrified any who dared approach her. The woman who had once been vulnerable became an instrument of defense. No one would violate her again. That's the nuance in Athena's justice. It rarely comforts. It doesn't validate feelings or offer catharsis. It recalibrates the world, makes it make sense again, even if that sense comes wrapped in cruelty. She didn't believe in happy endings. She believed in coherent ones. This extended beyond myth into philosophy. The idea that law should exist separate from passion, that decisions should be made not from instinct but from deliberation, that comes from her. The Greeks carved that belief into marble. They debated in open forums not to shout but to reach clarity. Their trials were public, their judgments reasoned. They tried, however imperfectly, to reflect her image in their institutions. And like Athena, their system wasn't without flaw. But it evolved. Because that too was part of her justice, the belief that change is earned, not granted. Athena didn't wield justice as a way to freeze the world in place. She used it to keep the structure from collapsing under its own contradictions. She didn't expect perfection, she expected effort, a recognition of pattern, a willingness to choose reason over revenge. And when she didn't find it, when mortals or gods insisted on blind fury or senseless destruction, she did not scream. She adjusted, quietly, completely. Even the Furies, ancient and terrifying, were brought into her new order. She could have fought them, tried to destroy them, but she didn't. She reframed them, gave them roles, transformed them from mindless avengers into guardians of lawful consequence. They didn't become kind, but they became focused. That was always her method. Chaos doesn't need to be obliterated. It needs to be contained, given purpose, directed into usefulness. Justice, in Athena's hands, was architecture, not an act, but a structure. It was something you lived inside, not something you saw fall from the sky. It didn't shake the ground when it arrived, but you noticed when it left. And that's the most enduring warning buried in her myths. When Athena is present, the world makes sense, even if that sense is cold. But when she withdraws, when discipline is replaced by indulgence, when thought is swallowed by noise, the structure cracks. Consequences pile up, and the gods, she knew, were rarely quick to clean up after each other. Athena didn't just restore balance. She reminded everyone why balance mattered in the first place. The memory of Athena never truly vanished, not even when the last temples crumbled or when her name faded from state-sponsored worship. Her image persisted, not as a forgotten deity confined to brittle scrolls, but as an evolving archetype, reshaped, reinterpreted, reabsorbed into every empire that fancied itself wise, disciplined, and justified. Where brute force demanded spectacle, Athena offered an alternative, the quiet power of ideology wrapped in aesthetics. And across time, rulers, artists, and thinkers reached back to her, not for her myths, but for her model. You saw it in sculpture first. The great chryselephantine statue by Phidias stood in the Parthenon not merely as ornament, but as a declaration. Made of gold and ivory, towering over worshippers, she was depicted not mid-battle, but in full armor, standing, watching, holding Nike, the spirit of victory, not as a war cry, but as a calm inevitability. Victory, she seemed to say, belongs to those who think before they act. The weight of that statue, both literal and symbolic, anchored Athens not just as a city of warriors, but as a civilization of measured ambition. Athena's aesthetic became shorthand for a particular kind of control, calm, composed, unflinching. It wasn't sensual like Aphrodite. It wasn't terrifying like Artemis in wrath. It was clean, geometric, logical. Her temples were precise in proportion, her expressions unemotional. Even in pottery, where other gods flared with movement and chaos, Athena stood still, shield in hand, eyes forward. Calculated symmetry in a world prone to frenzy. The Romans inherited this vision eagerly. Though they renamed her Minerva, the bones remained the same. She adorned their coins, their public baths, their libraries. She wasn't worshipped in ecstatic ritual like Dionysus, but institutionalized, embedded, used as emblem and endorsement. When emperors wished to project legitimacy, they borrowed her likeness, not because she made them feel divine, but because she made them appear just. Even Augustus, the architect of Rome's transition from republic to empire, leaned heavily on her symbolism. His reign was one of measured consolidation, dressed in the rhetoric of restoration. Who better than Minerva to embody this? She was both shield and scalpel, an icon of restraint that suited Augustus's brand of careful absolutism. The sword he wielded came with scrolls. Statues of her appeared near civic buildings. She was both watcher and warrant. He didn't pray to her, he wielded her. Later still, in the Renaissance, she emerged again, not in temples, but in allegories. Painters dressed her in silks instead of bronze, but her gaze remained unchanged. In Botticelli's canvas, she tames a centaur, not with violence, but with intellect. In Raphael's frescoes, She occupies the space of wisdom beside Plato and Aristotle. No longer just a goddess, she becomes a personification of human potential reason against savagery, order against chaos. This transformation wasn't accidental. It reflected something deep in the Western psyche, the hunger for power without blood, for empire without guilt. Athena offered that fantasy. She wasn't messy like the other gods. Her wars were always rational, her punishments always earned. She didn't need to seduce or deceive, she simply knew better, and you could either accept her guidance or be undone by it. And yet, this image, this calm, calculated, sculpted Athena, was a selective memory, because in truth, the goddess had always been more than the sum of her marble likenesses. She could be cruel in her logic. She could misjudge, as in her harshness toward Arachne. She could stand by silently while Odysseus suffered. Her wisdom wasn't always warm. It was often cold. But the empires that adopted her didn't want complication. They wanted legitimacy. By the Enlightenment, she was no longer just a figure from myth, but a symbol of secular ideals. She appeared on the seals of academies, on the emblems of societies that prized learning, law, and logic. Minerva's owl became a mascot for thought itself. Her shield was now metaphorical, a bulwark against ignorance. Universities named buildings after her. Military institutions borrowed her crest. The balance she once kept between sword and scroll now hung above courtrooms and parliament halls. In America, her echo was especially loud. The founding fathers, steeped in Greco-Roman admiration, peppered their new republic with classical references. Though Minerva was not enshrined like Lady Liberty, she was present in form and idea. She sat atop the US Capitol's original plans, her helmet peeking from behind banners of law. She appeared in education seals and military awards. The idea was clear. This was not just a nation of arms, but of ideas. And who better than Athena to lend it dignity? But here's the thing. Every time she was adopted, she lost something. In sculpture, she lost her capacity for doubt. In politics, she lost her capacity for wrath. In allegory, she lost her divine unpredictability. The real Athena, the one who defied gender roles, who argued cases in mythical courts, who punished with unnerving clarity, that Athena became background, replaced by a sanitized emblem, a lady of wisdom stripped of her edge. Still, the fact that she endured it all when so many gods fell into obscurity speaks to the potency of her core. She wasn't loved like Aphrodite. She wasn't feared like Hades. She was respected, needed, even by those who no longer believed. Athena became the scaffolding for how the West defined virtue, not faith, not charity, but competence. That became her legacy, the idea that thinking is sacred, that knowledge, when disciplined, is power, that you can be right without being loud, that you can be just without being soft. Her face didn't promise salvation, it promised structure. Athena became the scaffolding for how the West defined virtue, not faith, not charity, but competence. That became her legacy, the idea that thinking is sacred, that knowledge, when disciplined, is power, that you can be right without being loud, that you can be just without being soft. Her face didn't promise salvation, it promised structure. But the world doesn't always crave structure, especially not in its myths. And as modernity marched on, Athena's image began to fracture. The Industrial Age didn't just change cities, it changed narratives. The Romantic era recoiled from the cold elegance of reason and reached for emotion, chaos, instinct. Gods who bled and broke became far more compelling than those who reasoned. And Athena, so often cool, so often still, started to feel distant. She didn't vanish, but she became difficult to place. In a world chasing passion and spontaneity, a goddess of strategic restraint had little to offer pop culture's growing appetite for spectacle. Athena wasn't designed for myth's new age of vulnerability. She didn't cry, she didn't confess, she didn't need redemption. She was already complete, and that made her, paradoxically, unrelatable. And yet, the world kept needing her, even when it didn't realize it. She reappeared in movements, if not always in name. Every time a woman refused to be defined by beauty alone, Athena's armor flickered in the background. Every time knowledge was defended in a court or on a street, her shield resurfaced. She was no longer a figure to worship, but a presence to channel, a blueprint, a compass. In the 20th century, as feminism began redefining narratives, Athena's contradictions found new resonance. She was powerful, but within the patriarchal system of Olympus. She was a goddess, but born from the head of a god. She was a virgin, but not demure. She was rational, but not cold. She demanded respect, not affection. That made her complicated and useful. Some thinkers criticized her, calling her an enabler of male power, a goddess who upheld Zeus's authority, who punished women more than men. Others reclaimed her as a woman who carved space in a male world without compromising herself, a strategist, not a sycophant, a force who didn't seduce or manipulate, but still commanded fear. Whether as critique or icon, she sparked reflection. And that too was part of her power. In literature, she never disappeared. From Tennyson to Tolkien, her fingerprints are everywhere. Characters who blend wisdom and war, women who refuse to be sidelined by softness, mentors who challenge instead of coddle. They all trace back to her. Even in modern fantasy, she lingers. You see her in magical professors, armored queens, advisors who remain calm while kingdoms burn. But more than characters, she has become a lens. To look at Athena now is to ask what it means to be wise in a noisy world, what it means to lead without dominating, what it means to be strong without spectacle. In a time when performance often outweighs substance, her silence feels radical, her stillness revolutionary. She no longer belongs to temples, she belongs to tensions. Tensions between intellect and emotion, between justice and mercy, between strength and grace. She represents the space in between, the uncomfortable, untheatrical middle where decisions are made, not declared. That's why artists keep returning to her, not to praise her, but to pass her, to ask what she would do, not as goddess, but as idea. And the idea still matters. In a century rattled by misinformation, Athena's shield is not a weapon, it's a filter, a reminder to pause, to verify, to resist the first impulse. In boardrooms, her name adorns leadership programs. In protests, her likeness appears on signs demanding logic in governance. She's not invoked to bless, but to challenge. That's the difference now. Athena isn't a comfort. She's a standard. And standards are never easy. They expose laziness. They demand follow-through. They don't flinch. In every generation, there are those who tire of noise and long for clarity. And it's in those moments that Athena rises again. Not in myth, but in metaphor. Her myth, though, remains relevant. Not because it's divine, but because it's deeply human. A woman born not from womb, but from thought. A goddess who chose thought over thrill, clarity over chaos. Her tools weren't miracles. They were principles. That's why she survives. Where other gods fade into caricature, Athena becomes commentary. She adapts, not by changing, but by being recontextualized. She is the perennial question. How do you wield power when you are the smartest person in the room? Do you dominate? Do you withdraw? Or do you guide, quietly, effectively, without spectacle? That question has no single answer. But it echoes through every lecture hall, every courtroom, every moment when someone chooses logic over rage, discipline over indulgence. And in that echo, her legacy lives. Because the truth is, Athena was never about marble statues or ancient prayers. She was about choices, consistent ones, conscious ones, the kind that build cities, not just armies, that write laws, not just legends, the kind that don't need applause, only results. And for those who still choose thought before thunder, structure before screams, she remains, not as a goddess to fear, but as a mirror to face. She was a mirror to face. But in Olympus, mirrors weren't always welcome. In a realm where ego mattered more than truth, and where thunder often overpowered logic, Athena's quiet strength didn't just stand apart. It created friction. Among gods bred on impulse and self-indulgence, Her presence was a challenge. She didn't just hold her own, she forced others to reflect. And reflection, in a world of gods who preferred admiration, was rarely comfortable. Take Poseidon. The sea god, unpredictable as his domain, was not fond of Athena's precision. Their rivalry was ancient, elemental, and deeply symbolic. When Athens was yet unnamed, both deities laid claim. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, and a saltwater spring surged up, mighty, yes, but undrinkable. Athena, on the other hand, planted an olive tree, unassuming, slow to grow, but it promised sustenance, wood, oil, economy. The city chose her gift, and with it her name. This wasn't just a win in myth, it was a victory for thought over theatrics, patience over flash. And Poseidon never forgave her. Their tension didn't remain isolated. It threaded itself through stories like the Odyssey, where Athena is Odysseus's steady patron, while Poseidon dogs him with storms. One guides with strategy, the other lashes out with spite. It wasn't just a clash of gods, it was a clash of philosophies. And for mortals caught in between, it mattered deeply whose approach prevailed. Then there was Ares, the god of war in its rawest, bloodiest form. Where Athena calculated, Ares charged. He embodied rage without reason. Chaos for its own sake, he was the fist, she was the hand that aimed it. In theory, they shared a domain. In practice, they couldn't have been further apart. And it showed. In Homeric battles, Ares screams and slaughters, indiscriminate and loud. Athena appears with calm eyes, directing tactics, choosing moments. In the Iliad, when she intervenes, it's not to spill more blood but to shift outcomes with precision. She's the general, the advisor, the strategist, and the soldiers loved her for it. Because while Ares gloried in their deaths, Athena tried to ensure they weren't wasted. Their rivalry reached a point of humiliation. In one myth, Athena physically overpowers Ares, coolly, efficiently. No drama, just skill. She throws a stone. He falls. It wasn't even close. For a god built on brawn, it was a shattering blow. And again, it wasn't just a contest between deities. It was commentary. On what kind of power lasts, on which kind of war makes sense. But Athena's true equal, perhaps even her foil, was Hera, queen of the gods, master of political maneuvering. Where Athena prized clarity, Hera wielded subtlety. Where Athena refused to marry, Hera was defined by a marriage she never truly controlled. Theirs was not open conflict, but a quiet, simmering tension. They operated in similar spaces. Counsel, influence, intervention, but with wildly different motives. Hera's power came from position, Athena's from merit. Hera played long games of vengeance. Athena solved immediate crises. Hera needed Zeus to validate her status. Athena didn't need Zeus at all. And that independence, in a pantheon thick with hierarchy, was radical. But even Zeus, father, king, sky tyrant, wasn't exempt from her scrutiny. For all his thunder, he feared her mind. She was, after all, born from his head, fully armoured, without warning. A manifestation of his own thoughts, yes, but also of his vulnerabilities. Because she represented what he couldn't control, an intellect not shaped by seduction, not swayed by temper, not impressed by display. Zeus trusted her, often more than his other children. But trust didn't mean equality. She was rarely given Olympus's highest decisions. When it came to judgment, she was consulted. When it came to power, she was contained. Yet she found influence anyway, not by force, but by consistency. She didn't need to rebel, she simply refused to falter. Even Hermes, god of wit and words, tread carefully around her. They both moved in spaces others didn't understand. Strategy, negotiation, manipulation. But while Hermes dealt in tricks and twists, Athena dealt in structures. One was the clever whisper, the other, the architectural plan. She saw the long game, and often it was her hand behind the scenes that ensured stability. This made her few friends among the gods. Divinity, in Olympus, was about spectacle. Athena didn't care for spectacle, she cared for solutions. And gods who prioritized glory found that unsettling. But mortals? Mortals adored her. Because she didn't demand worship through fear, she earned it through action. Still, the Olympians had their moments of pettiness. They mocked her virginity, confused her calm for coldness, her discipline for detachment. Dionysus, the wild god of revelry, once tried to assert superiority by claiming to offer ecstasy, while she offered nothing but thought. But thought, as Athena well knew, was its own form of liberation, just quieter, just slower, but far more permanent. It's why her rivalries were never loud, never theatrical. She didn't engage in divine soap operas, she simply outlasted them. When the wine soured, when the waves calmed, when the battles ended, Athena's voice still echoed, offering plans, offering stability, offering clarity. And that clarity didn't just shake the gods, it shaped how mortals viewed divinity. In a world of thunderbolts and betrayals, Athena represented something rare, the idea that divine power could be rational, that a god could be admirable not for passion, but for principle. But the gods, especially the chaotic ones, sensed this, and it unnerved them. Because a goddess like Athena didn't need followers to throw festivals, she needed them to think, and that was far more dangerous. Her greatest battles weren't fought with spears, they were fought in perception, in the slow, quiet war between spectacle and substance. And despite Olympus's noise, despite its endless dramas, she never flinched. She didn't have to. Athena didn't have to flinch because her power never depended on chaos. It was rooted in clarity, measured, consistent, sometimes quiet, but always undeniable. And in Olympus, that kind of steadiness was a threat, a realm built on thunder and drama, divine tantrums and impulsive miracles, didn't quite know what to do with a goddess who preferred logic to lightning. The rest of the gods weren't just uneasy around Athena, they were in some sense outpaced by her. While Apollo chased perfection in poetry and prophecy, his pride often overrode his perception. Athena didn't chase, she constructed. Apollo would weep for doomed lovers, sing of unavoidable fate. Athena would draft the treaty that prevented the war in the first place. Emotionally, he soared higher. Practically, she landed deeper. Even Artemis, her fellow virgin goddess, wielded solitude differently. Artemis stalked the wilds, protective of innocence, a goddess of instinct. But Athena's solitude was mental, not physical. She wasn't removed because she feared the world, she was apart because she needed space to think. Artemis punished violation. Athena prevented it. Both were independent, but one was reactive, the other anticipatory. It's why mortals seeking guidance, especially kings, judges and inventors, turn to Athena. She didn't seduce or threaten, she advised, and in a pantheon ruled by passion, that was revolutionary. She brought order not by bending wills, but by showing better paths. When she aided Perseus, it wasn't to glorify violence, it was to enable precision. He didn't slay Medusa in a frenzy, he did it with a mirror, with tools she gave him. She didn't stop war, but she shaped its outcomes. She guided Odysseus not because he was the strongest, but because he was the cleverest. And in her world, cleverness mattered more than courage. That philosophy was clear. Brute strength is impressive, but unsustainable. Strategy, on the other hand, builds legacies. But legacy is exactly where Athena's relationships frayed. Because while mortals admired her, many gods resented her. She never seemed to need Olympus the way they did. While Dionysus threw festivals and Aphrodite spun lust, Athena remained composed, untouched by mortal chaos. Her temples were quieter, her followers fewer but more devoted. She didn't dazzle. She educated. And education, unlike entertainment, has long-term consequences. This tension simmered beneath Olympus like a fault line, and once in a while it cracked. Not through open rebellion. Athena wasn't interested in coups, but through divine decisions that revealed just how precarious her position was. One such decision came during the infamous judgment of Paris. It was a contest born from ego, as most disasters are. Eris, the goddess of discord, threw a golden apple marked for the fairest. Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena each claimed it. Zeus, unsurprisingly wanting no part of it, delegated the decision to a Trojan prince named Paris. Each goddess offered a bribe. Hera promised power, Aphrodite love, specifically Helen of Sparta. And Athena, she offered wisdom and military glory, but Paris, young and ruled by desire, chose Aphrodite. It was a rejection Athena didn't forget, not because she lost, she'd been passed over before, but because her offer was the only one that required work. The other gifts were instant. Hers required discipline, vision, effort. That rejection wasn't just a slight, it was a cultural signal that beauty, not strategy, moved men. That emotion, not intellect, won hearts. And so, when the Trojan War began, sparked by Paris's choice, Athena was not just an ally of the Greeks, she was a force. She didn't care for Helen's beauty or Menelaus's pride. She cared that justice had been dismissed in favor of temptation, and she made sure the Greeks didn't forget it. But even in war, her influence wasn't just tactical, it was symbolic. Athena was not screaming from chariots or casting plagues. She was whispering to commanders, guiding hands, steadying nerves. Where Apollo might smite, she suggested. Where Ares might brawl, she positioned. And in the Iliad, her presence often determined the tide of battle, not through strength, but through smart intervention. Yet for all her restraint, she could be ruthless. When her patience ran thin, she struck with precision. Take Ajax the Lesser. After the war, he defiled a temple, dragging Cassandra, a priestess, by force from Athena's sacred space. That wasn't just impiety, it was arrogance, and Athena didn't tolerate arrogance. She waited, as she always did, for the right moment. Then she unleashed a storm upon Ajax's fleet. He survived the wreck, boasting that even the gods couldn't kill him. That was the final error. Hubris on top of sacrilege. Poseidon, often her rival, saw the insult too and helped finish the punishment. Ajax died not in glory, but as a warning. Athena didn't act out of wrath. She acted out of principle. This pattern repeated throughout her divine career. Athena rarely intervened without cause, but when she did, it was final. She didn't lecture. She taught. Through example, through justice, through the long memory of consequence. And those consequences weren't limited to individuals. Sometimes entire cities felt them. When the Greeks sacked Troy, despite her support, their impiety disgusted her. They tore temples, disrespected the divine, and Athena turned on them, not with open declarations, but by withdrawing protection, letting fate and folly devour them. This is where her rivalry with the gods took a quieter turn. It wasn't about duels or disputes anymore. It was about standards. She began to serve as a silent barometer. How gods treated mortals, how mortals treated gods. Athena remembered. And while others forgave easily, she didn't. Not because she was vengeful, but because she believed memory mattered. She understood something Olympus often forgot, that power is not just about presence, it's about precedent. That divine action sets the tone for mortal behavior. That when gods behave foolishly, humans follow. And when gods hold themselves accountable, societies improve. That belief made her not just a rival to individual gods, but a quiet reformer of divinity itself. She challenged Olympus not through rebellion, but through example. She didn't shout. She led. And in the rare air of Olympus, where storms and seductions defined reputations, that kind of leadership stood alone. Athena's power was never confined to Olympus. Gods rise and fade with worship, their temples stripped for stone, their names eroded by centuries. But Athena escaped that fate because her influence was never just divine. It was intellectual. She wasn't bound to ritual sacrifices or seasonal festivals. She was bound to the very act of thought itself. And thought, once planted, doesn't vanish. It spreads, it mutates, it finds new hosts in new eras. Athena's true temple was not the Parthenon, but the human mind. Athens itself was the most obvious example. The city bore her name not as ornament, but as creed. To be Athenian was to be, at least in theory, rational, civic-minded, disciplined. Its institutions mirrored her values. Courts replaced vendettas, debates replaced decrees. Decisions were measured, contested, tested. Even art reflected this balance. Tragedies in the theatre weren't just entertainments, they were laboratories for moral thought. Sculptures weren't just decoration, they were exercises in proportion and symmetry. In every corner of the city, Athena's shadow lingered, not in fear, but in expectation. Philosophy, too, grew in her garden. Plato's academy, built within a grove sacred to her, functioned less like a temple and more like an altar of dialogue. Students didn't sacrifice goats, they sacrificed certainty. They dismantled assumptions, subjected them to dialectic fire, and sought truth not through revelation, but through reason. And what deity better suited to preside than Athena? She didn't demand blind faith. She demanded intellectual courage, to question, to refine, to endure ambiguity without collapsing into despair. In her spirit, philosophy thrived not as dogma, but as discipline, and from that discipline flowed politics. The very notion of democracy, flawed, fragile, often hypocritical, was nonetheless grounded in her principle that power should be debated, not simply imposed, that laws should be structured, not improvised, that leadership requires thought, not just charisma. When Athenians gathered to cast their votes, they were enacting a ritual as sacred as any sacrifice. They weren't just deciding policy, they were honoring a goddess who stood for reasoned action. But Athena's influence did not stop at the borders of her city. As Greek culture spread through conquest, trade, colonization, her archetype traveled with it. Rome renamed her Minerva and absorbed her into its civic identity. She became the goddess of guilds, schools, libraries. Her face adorned coins, her figure stood in forums. Romans admired Mars for victory, but they trusted Minerva for governance. She was the quieter patron of empire, not celebrated in triumphal arches, but embedded in institutions that outlasted emperors. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, she returned again, not as a deity, but as a symbol of humanism. Artists painted her not to be worshipped, but to embody ideals. Botticelli showed her taming a centaur, intellect reigning over instinct. Raphael placed her among philosophers, not among revelers. She was no longer invoked for battle, but for balance, between body and mind, between past and present, between faith and reason. And then came the Enlightenment, when her legacy was secularized completely. Minerva's owl became a mascot for wisdom itself, perched atop books, adorning emblems of academies and societies. She was no longer divine at all. She was principle, stripped of mythology, reimagined as philosophy. Justice statues in modern courts, blindfolded and bearing scales, are her descendants. So are universities that chose her image as this. She was transformed into civic virtue, a reminder that societies thrive not on noise or force, but on order and clarity. Athena's journey from goddess to symbol reveals something remarkable. She was too useful to abandon. Aphrodite faded because beauty changes with time. Ares waned because war alone destroys more than it sustains. Zeus became a literary figure, a cautionary tale of lust and tyranny. But Athena endured because wisdom, when paired with discipline, never loses relevance. Civilization itself needs her, whether it names her or not. Yet this endurance came at a cost. The real Athena, with her contradictions and cruelties, her harsh lessons and cold punishments, was softened. The Medusa story, the trial of Orestes, the silencing of Arachne, these jagged edges were filed down in later centuries. What remained was a sanitized emblem of wisdom, stripped of danger. But the ancients knew better. They knew her wisdom was not gentle, it was sharp, demanding, sometimes merciless. To follow Athena meant not comfort, but challenge. And perhaps that is why she lasted, because she represented not what humans wanted, but what they needed. In every age of crisis, leaders rediscovered her. In revolution, she became liberty. In empire, she became strategy. In academia, she became reason. She wore different masks, but her core was the same, a goddess who stood for clarity over chaos, foresight over frenzy, justice over revenge. The names changed, but the mirror remained. When societies looked for guidance, they still saw her staring back, and that is perhaps her greatest victory. Not the olive tree, not the Trojan horse, not even the Parthenon, but survival, not as myth, but as metaphor. Athena shaped not just the stories of the Greeks, but the very architecture of thought that still underpins the modern world. Athena shaped the architecture of thought, But what is most striking is how her influence seeped into areas far beyond philosophy or law. She infiltrated art, science, education, even politics, in ways subtle yet persistent. Unlike gods who demanded worship through spectacle, she lived on because her qualities were transferable. A society could remove her temples, deny her divinity, and yet still cling to her principles. This adaptability is why she survived where louder deities dissolved into myth alone. Consider the way science grew under her shadow. The Greeks linked her not just with strategy, but with craft. She was a patron of metalworkers, inventors, and builders. The gears of innovation, the meticulous discipline of craft work, the careful design of armor and ships, these fell under her influence. And when Rome absorbed her as Minerva, she became associated with artisans, scholars, and tradesmen. To dedicate a workshop to Minerva was not superstition, but acknowledgement. Creation itself required thought, not brute force. That seed carried forward into the guilds of the Middle Ages and the academies of the Renaissance. The spirit of her precision can still be traced in the very structure of universities, which organized knowledge the way she organized war plans. Education itself took her as patron. Medieval scholars, steeped in classical memory, carved her image into manuscripts. Renaissance thinkers placed her at the center of allegories about wisdom guiding power. Even modern institutions leaned on her iconography. The owl, her constant companion, remains a global symbol for learning. And this is telling. The creature associated with her isn't fierce, isn't glamorous, isn't even particularly sociable. It is watchful, patient, silent, seeing through darkness. That image has outlasted even her own name. Students across the world wear owls on graduation crests without realizing they are invoking her. Politically, Athena's afterlife is just as profound. Every society that sought to legitimize itself as rational borrowed from her archetype. Revolutionary France painted her as liberty, wearing armor while embodying reason. The United States placed her image on seals and statues, transforming her into a mother of democracy. The British built her into allegories of justice and empire. She travelled continents not as a foreign goddess, but as an idea wrapped in familiar symbols: helmet, shield, owl, olive branch. Each empire bent her to its needs, but the through line remained. Athena represented disciplined intelligence harnessed for governance. What is fascinating, though, is how her sharpness was blunted in these appropriations. The dangerous edge of her myths, the harshness of Arachne's punishment, the mercilessness of Medusa's transformation, the cold neutrality of Orestes' acquittal. These elements faded in retellings. Athena became polished into an emblem of balance and calm, stripped of her unsettling contradictions. But perhaps that was inevitable. Civilizations don't like difficult mirrors. They prefer emblems that flatter them. And yet, underneath the softened veneer, the true Athena still flickers, reminding anyone who digs deeper that wisdom without cost is an illusion. She is also embedded in the Western obsession with the balance of opposites. The Greeks saw her as the counterweight to Ares, war shaped by reason, not rage. Later ages saw her as the counter to Dionysus, clarity against chaos. In modern narratives, she has become the archetype of rationality itself, placed opposite to emotional excess. This dualism, still embedded in political speeches, corporate slogans, and cultural ideals, can be traced straight back to her myths. Whenever leaders call for measured response, whenever educators argue that thought must temper instinct, Athena's voice whispers beneath the rhetoric. Her archetype even infiltrates popular culture in ways most don't recognize. Characters in novels, films, and games who embody discipline, wisdom, and tactical mastery owe something to her lineage. Mentor figures who prize intellect over might, women who stand apart from traditional roles yet command respect. These are modern reskins of Athena. She lingers not because people name her, but because stories need her. Every narrative that pits intellect against brute force, every plot where strategy defeats chaos, is retelling her lessons in disguise. Yet her endurance raises a harder question. Have we truly learned what she represented, or have we only borrowed her image? For Athena was not gentle. She was not a patron of easy truths or comforting lies. She demanded clarity even when clarity hurt, She rewarded discipline, even when discipline cost dearly. To honor her was not to feel safe, but to feel accountable. And in that sense, modern appropriations may miss the point. They use her as emblem of wisdom, but they forget she also punished ignorance. They celebrate her as symbol of reason, but they forget reason itself can wound. Still, even softened, her archetype has weight. A society that values debate over decree, evidence over impulse, structure over spectacle, that society, knowingly or not, still lives under her gaze. She may not demand sacrifices anymore, but she demands something harder, effort. She lingers every time a courtroom chooses deliberation over vengeance, every time a student chooses study over distraction, every time a leader chooses restraint over reaction. She is invoked not in prayer, but in practice. That is the truest proof of her survival. A god forgotten is one whose lessons fade. Athena's lessons have not faded. They have been translated into institutions, symbols, and habits of thought so deeply embedded we no longer recognize their origin. And maybe that is her greatest victory, not to be remembered as myth, but to be lived as method. To shape civilization not through thunder, but through structure. And so the mortal mind carries her still, not as goddess, not as idol, but as discipline. She is the invisible teacher behind libraries, the quiet presence in courtrooms, the unspoken demand in classrooms. She is not prayed to, but practiced. And that, for Athena, was always the point. And so, as the candle burns low, and the stories of gods and mortals slip back into silence, remember this: Athena was never just a figure of myth. She was a reminder that thought is stronger than thunder, and that wisdom, though quiet, outlasts every storm. Sleep well, history lovers. Until next time, may clarity guide your dreams.